Inigo Philbert, step away from the sales desk and keep your hands visible.
Hold on, who are you? Show me identification first.
Federal agents. The art ownership fraud is over.
I'm not talking until I see credentials and a warrant. I know my right.
To his collectors, Inigo Philbrick was one of the most brilliant art dealers of his generation. To federal investigators, he was something else entirely. The architect of the largest art fraud in American history.
You sold more than 100% of the same works to people who never knew.
I don't care what you think you have. You're not doing this right. You're not following.
He walked out of that federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, knowing he would spend the next 7 years inside a United States Bureau of Prisons facility. The FBI's art crime team called it the largest art fraud in American history. $86 million in loans and sale proceeds, a Basquiat, a Christopher Wool, a Rudolf Stingel portrait of Picasso, and a collector named Martin Herrero who never actually existed. Inigo Philbrick had built an empire on paintings he had already sold to somebody else, and by the time it collapsed, he had sold more than 100% of certain artworks to investors who had no idea any of the others were in the picture. Before we go any further into this one, I have to ask you something. Have you ever bought something expensive on the word of somebody you trusted, and then later wondered if you actually owned what you paid for? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you are new to the channel, hit subscribe. We cover white-collar cases like this one every week, and the way this one comes apart is unlike anything the art world had ever seen. Now let me tell you how a kid from Western Massachusetts ended up running a fraud that would rattle the entire contemporary art market from Mayfair to Miami to Hong Kong. Inigo Philbrick was born in 1987 in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, a small Berkshire town of about 2,000 people, best known as the summer home of the illustrator Norman Rockwell. His mother was a writer, his father, Harry Philbrick, was a working artist who would later become the director of the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and then the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia. Art was not something Inigo picked up along the way. Art was the family business. By the time he was 10 years old, he had already sat through more gallery openings than most collectors attend in a lifetime. He grew up around canvases in progress, wet studio smells, and the low hum of adults arguing about whether a piece was worth what it was priced. His father's colleagues came to dinner. Museum trustees came to Sunday lunch. Curators corrected his pronunciation of names like Rauschenberg and Twombly before he was out of middle school. He was, by every account, a bright kid. Quick, personable, slightly too aware of how bright he was. He attended the Buxton School in Williamstown, a small progressive boarding school with about 90 students, where teachers described him in end-of-year reports as articulate, socially confident, and ambitious in ways that occasionally outpace his patience. After Buxton, he crossed the Atlantic. He enrolled at Goldsmiths, University of London, in the mid-2000s. The same institution that had produced Damien Hirst and the rest of the young British artists a generation earlier. Goldsmiths did not just train painters, it trained a certain kind of mind. Sharp, ironic, comfortable with the idea that value in the art world is manufactured, not discovered. He was still an undergraduate when he was hired as an intern at White Cube, J. Jopling's gallery in Hoxton Square. Jopling was already one of the most powerful dealers in London. White Cube was the epicenter of everything that mattered in contemporary British art. Philbrick showed up in a suit when everyone else was in jeans, made himself useful, and never asked to leave. By his early 20s, he was working for Jopling directly on secondary market deals worth millions. Jopling later described the young Philbrick in a court letter as phenomenally talented, unusually driven, and one of the most naturally gifted dealers he had ever met. He gave him serious responsibility. He introduced him to serious money. In 2011, when Philbrick was 24 years old, Jopling backed him with a reported £3 million to open his own space in London. The gallery, on Davies Street in Mayfair, was tiny by London standards. But the address was everything. Mayfair was where the money lived. He put on shows of secondary market work, meaning pieces already sold once to a collector and now being resold, often quietly, often for enormous sums. He dealt in Basquiat, Wool, Rudolf Stingel, the Italian painter whose photorealist portraits of other artists were fetching 7 and 8 figures at auction. He was good at it, genuinely good at it. He had an eye. He had contacts. He had, above all, a story people wanted to be part of. A young man from the American art aristocracy, trained at Goldsmiths, blessed by Jay Jopling, taking on the fusty old dealers of Bond Street. Auction house specialists returned his calls before lunch. Collectors flew him to Aspen for the weekend. He opened a second space in Miami's design district in 2018. Miami was where the American money spent its winters, and Miami loved him. By his early 30s, he was traveling private, staying in the Mandarin Oriental, and dating a well-known British reality television personality named Victoria Baker Harbour. He had a daughter. He wore bespoke Anderson and Shepherd suits. He drank Petrus at dinner and complained when it wasn't chilled to precisely the right temperature. Everyone assumed he was rich because the paintings said he was rich. The paintings, it would turn out, were the problem. To understand what Philbrick did, you have to understand the contemporary art market. Because unlike stocks, bonds, real estate, or almost any other asset class of comparable value, the contemporary art market runs almost entirely on trust, reputation, and paperwork that no one is required to show anyone else. Here is how it works. A collector buys a painting at auction or from a dealer for, say, $12 million. That painting hangs on a wall, or more often sits in a climate-controlled Freeport warehouse in Geneva or Delaware, and it appreciates. Or it doesn't. When the collector wants liquidity, they do not put the painting on eBay. They call a dealer. The dealer finds a buyer, quietly, in a private sale. There is no public listing. There is no exchange. There is no regulator watching the transaction. The bill of sale is usually a 1 or 2 page document. The wire transfers happen through the dealer's client account. Ownership can be split between multiple parties, each holding a percentage stake, in an arrangement called a joint venture. Joint ventures are common. A dealer might put up 30%, a private collector another 40%, an investment fund the remaining 30%. When the painting is eventually resold, everyone takes their proportional cut. The vulnerabilities in this system are enormous. There is no central registry of ownership. If you own 40% of a Basquiat, the only proof you own it is whatever piece of paper the dealer gave you. There is no title company, there is no lien search, there is no Carfax for paintings. Paintings can be used as collateral for loans. Specialty lenders like Athena Art Finance and various private banks will lend against the appraised value of a work, sometimes up to 50%. The lender takes a security interest in the painting, in theory. In practice, the painting stays wherever it was, and the lender relies on the dealer to be honest about who else has claims on it. And the valuations themselves are, to be polite, imaginative. There is no book value for a contemporary painting. There is only the last comparable sale, and whatever the dealer says the market will bear. 2 respected dealers can look at the same Christopher Wool and appraise it $8 million apart with a straight face. Both appraisals will be considered legitimate. Add all of that up. No public record of ownership, no regulator, confidential transactions, multiple parties who never speak to each other, valuations pulled from thin air, paintings sitting in warehouses that nobody physically inspects, loans issued against appraisals that nobody independently verifies. It is a market designed by and for people who trust each other, or at least people who want to look like they trust each other. Inigo Philbrick had grown up inside that market. He knew every soft spot. Starting around 2016, he began pushing on all of them at once. The scheme, when prosecutors finally reconstructed it, was almost elegant in its simplicity. He would acquire a valuable painting, or acquire an interest in one. Then he would sell ownership stakes in that painting to multiple investors, separately, confidentially, without telling any of them about the others. Take the Rudolf Stingel painting. A 2012 Stingel work depicting Pablo Picasso, photorealistic, roughly 6 feet tall, executed in oil and enamel on canvas. Philbrick told one investor he owned 50%. He told another investor he also owned 50%. Then, according to the government's filings, he told a third investor he owned an additional stake, bringing total sold ownership above 100% of a single physical painting. When the painting sold at auction, the math would not work. There was not enough painting to go around. He did the same thing with a 1982 Jean-Michel Basquiat titled Humidity. He did it with an untitled Christopher Wool. Prosecutors would later find spreadsheets on his own computer where he tracked the ownership stakes he had sold, and the columns did not add up. On some works, the total sold stakes exceeded 130% of the piece. He also used the same paintings as loan collateral. He would take a work in which he had already sold 90% to outside investors, walk into a specialty art lender like Athena Art Finance, and pledge 100% of the painting as security for a multi-million-dollar loan. The lender would appraise the work, do its paper due diligence, and wire the money. The work stayed in the warehouse. The investors stayed in the dark. The loan officer stayed unaware that 90 cents on every dollar of that collateral already belonged to somebody else. When paintings sold, he sometimes sold them without telling the co-owners at all. The proceeds went into his accounts and were spent or used to pay off older obligations, or rolled into new acquisitions to keep the appearance of a booming business. To make the paper trail hold together, he manufactured documents, bills of sale with invented buyers, consignment agreements with inflated numbers, provenance letters citing collectors who had never actually touched the work in question. On one document, prosecutors would later find he used the actual name and identifying information of a real living person who had no idea their identity was being attached to an 8-figure art transaction. Identity theft, quietly folded into the wallpaper of the scheme. And then there was Martin Herrero. Martin Herrero was, according to Philbrick's paperwork, an Argentine art collector based in Buenos Aires. Cultured, wealthy, somewhat reclusive in the way that serious South American collectors sometimes are. Herrero, according to invoices Philbrick furnished, had purchased a significant painting through Philbrick's gallery. Herrero, according to email correspondence Philbrick produced, was slow to pay. Herrero, according to a bill of sale on Philbrick's letterhead, was legally on the hook for millions of dollars owed to Philbrick's former mentor, the very man who had staked him in the business. Martin Herrero did not exist. There was no such person. Philbrick had invented him. He had set up an email account in Herrero's name. He had written correspondence back and forth as Herrero in a mildly Spanish-accented English, apologizing for delays, promising imminent wire transfers, citing complications with Argentine currency controls and offshore banking. For roughly a year, Philbrick corresponded with his own mentor as the phantom buyer to buy himself time. That was the level of detail. That was the depth of the deception. He was not just fudging numbers on a spreadsheet. He was performing an entire fictional character across email threads over the course of months in a second voice to keep the walls from closing in on the first one. We are about to get into how this whole thing came apart. Before we do, if you have made it this far, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Cases like this one, cases that rattle entire industries, do not always get the coverage they deserve. We cover them here, in detail, every single week. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Now let's get into how it actually collapsed. Every fraud has a moment when the arithmetic simply refuses to cooperate anymore. For Inigo Philbrick, that moment arrived in October of 2019. A German investment fund called Fine Art Partners, known in the industry as FAP, had lent against and taken interests in several works Philbrick had put together in various joint ventures. FAP was not a naive party. It was staffed by lawyers and specialists who knew the art world's paperwork rituals. But it had trusted Philbrick's documentation. And now it wanted to sell one of the paintings, and it wanted the sale confirmed against the underlying ownership records. The underlying ownership records did not confirm. Around the same time, a company called Guzzini Properties, based in the British Virgin Islands, filed a lawsuit in London, demanding an injunction on the sale of a Rudolf Stingel painting. Guzzini claimed it had purchased a majority stake in the Stingel. Athena Art Finance, the specialty lender, had a claim on the same work. FAP had another. Multiple parties, each holding documentation showing they owned pieces of the same painting, discovered each other in the course of a single week. Once the co-investors began comparing notes, the entire structure came apart in days. One collector called another. That collector called his lawyer. The lawyer called Athena. Athena called FAP. FAP called Sotheby's. The messages came in one after another. Do you have an interest in Stengel work reference number so-and-so? Yes. Do you also have an interest in the Basquiat titled Humidity? Yes. Would you be surprised to learn that 4 other parties believe they own the majority of that same painting? They would be, in fact, extremely surprised. On October 15th, 2019, Philbrick was formally notified he had defaulted on a loan of approximately $14 million. Athena Art Finance filed suit in New York. Within weeks, more than a dozen civil actions were filed against him in courts on 3 continents. His galleries in London and Miami went silent. His email account went silent. His phone stopped taking calls. At the end of October, Inigo Philbrick disappeared. His staff arrived at the Miami Gallery on Northwest 24th Street and found the lights off. No note, no forwarding information. His London office on Davies Street reported him unreachable. Victoria Baker Harbour, his partner, and their infant daughter were also gone. For 6 months, no one who was owed money by Inigo Philbrick knew where he was. There were sightings in Australia, rumors of Southeast Asia. A hedge fund investor put a private investigator on the case. Nothing came back. He had chosen his hiding place carefully, Vanuatu, a small Pacific island nation of about 300,000 people, roughly 1,700 miles east of Australia. No extradition treaty with the United States. Warm water, cheap real estate. The kind of place where a man with cash could rent a bungalow on the beach and go quiet. He rented a bungalow on the beach. He went quiet. He did not stay quiet long enough. The FBI's art crime team is a small unit, roughly 24 agents across the country, specialists in cultural property theft and art market fraud. When the civil suits against Philbrick began piling up in the Southern District of New York in late 2019, the case landed on their desks almost immediately. They started with the paper. Because in this fraud, the paper was everything. Federal agents worked with civil plaintiffs' attorneys to obtain copies of every contract, every bill of sale, every wire transfer record, every consignment agreement that Philbrick had furnished to any investor or lender during the relevant years. They mapped them, they cross-referenced them, and what they built over the course of several months was a spreadsheet of their own. On the left, each artwork. Across the top, each purported owner. In the cells, the percentage stake each party believed they held. The Rudolf Stengel Picasso portrait tallied to more than 130% sold. The Basquiat Humidity tallied similarly. The Christopher Wool untitled work tallied above 100%. Painting after painting. The columns did not close. In some cases, 5 different parties held bills of sale for majority stakes in a single physical object, hanging in a single warehouse in Delaware or Geneva. Then the agents got into Philbrick's own devices. Through subpoenas served on cloud providers and email hosts, they recovered what he had left behind. What he had left behind was a fraud he had never expected anyone to actually audit. There was, first of all, a handwritten note. Legal pad yellow paper, blue ballpoint, in Philbrick's own handwriting. Musing, in the way a person muses when they think nobody will ever read it, about strategies for extracting additional funds from a particular repeat investor. Notes on what the investor had already bought. Notes on what the investor might be persuaded to buy next. Notes on what could be told and what would need to be concealed. There were spreadsheets on his laptop tracking ownership stakes in each painting. His own spreadsheets, his own math. The columns showed clearly to anyone reading them that the total percentages sold exceeded 100%. He had not just done this. He had kept his own records of doing it. And there was the Martin Herrero correspondence. Agents pulled the email account, IP logs showed the account had been created from Philbrick's own devices. The messages sent from Herrero to Philbrick and from Herrero to Philbrick's former mentor had originated from the same networks Philbrick himself used. The Spanish-inflected English had been drafted, edited, and sent by Philbrick. One exchange, later cited by prosecutors, went roughly like this. Mentor, April 2019. Inigo, I still have not received the wire from Mr. Herrero. This has now been 6 months. Can you please give me an update? Philbrick, as Herrero, 3 days later. Dear Sir, my sincere apologies for the delay. My accountants are working on the transfer through Buenos Aires, and there have been complications with the currency controls in Argentina. I assure you the funds will be with you shortly. Kind regards, Martin. Mentor to Philbrick, July 2019. Any update on Herrero? I am getting concerned. Philbrick to Mentor, July 2019. I have been on him. He assures me he is working on it. I know he is good for it. For a year, he had written to the man who had launched his career, pretending to be a South American collector who owed money and was slow to send it, so that the actual money he owed his mentor would appear to be someone else's problem. One investigator described it later as the most sustained act of impersonation he had ever encountered in a white-collar case. Not a forged signature, not a shell company, an entire fictional human being corresponding in real time across seasons, holidays, and market cycles. Meanwhile, in Vanuatu, Philbrick was being watched. Federal agents worked with the Vanuatu police force to confirm his location. On June 12, 2020, on the island of Espiritu Santo, Vanuatu police, acting on a provisional arrest request from the United States, took him into custody outside his rented bungalow. He was flown to Guam in the custody of United States Marshals, and from Guam to New York. His first appearance in the Southern District of New York was on June 15, 2020. Wire fraud, 1 count. Aggravated identity theft, 1 count. The government's initial estimate of the total loss was $20 million. That number would grow. The moment the arrest happened, on the audio the Vanuatu police captured of the operation, Philbrick did not fight. He was standing outside his bungalow. Local officers approached. An FBI liaison stood back on the packed dirt driveway. The lead officer identified himself and stated the purpose of the encounter. Officer, Mr. Philbrick, we are executing a provisional arrest warrant on behalf of the government of the United States. Philbrick did not run. He did not shout. He did not, in the manner of many white-collar defendants, insist there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Philbrick, I know. The officer asked him to place his hands on his head. He complied. Philbrick, I know what this is about. Can I get my shoes? He was allowed to retrieve his shoes. Victoria was in the bungalow with their daughter. He asked to say goodbye. He was allowed to say goodbye. He was then walked, in the flip-flops he had been wearing on the beach, into a waiting vehicle. On the flight to Guam, according to reports later filed by the accompanying deputies, he made no unsolicited statements about the case. He asked about food. He asked about phone calls. He asked at one point whether his mentor had been notified of the arrest. He was told he could speak with counsel once he was in the Southern District. Philbrick, I understand. Then he was quiet. Inigo. Philbrick appeared before a magistrate judge in the Southern District of New York on June 15, 2020, and was ordered detained. He was moved to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn to await proceedings. Bail was set, negotiated, and eventually posted. He was released to home confinement in Manhattan with electronic monitoring. Over the course of the next 17 months, his lawyers negotiated with prosecutors in the Office of the United States Attorney for the Southern District. The government had by then refined the total loss number. Not 20 million, not 40 million, over $86 million in loans and sale proceeds obtained by fraud. On November 15, 2021, Inigo Philbrick appeared before United States District Judge Sidney H. Stein and pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud. The plea agreement stipulated that the aggravated identity theft count would be dismissed at sentencing. The plea agreement stipulated a forfeiture obligation. The plea agreement did not stipulate a sentence. Sentencing was set for May 23, 2022. Between the plea and the sentencing, the victims came forward. There was the German Art Investment Fund, which had lost 8 figures on paintings whose ownership had been sold 5 times over. There was Athena Art Finance, which had loaned money against collateral that was not, in any meaningful sense, actually available as collateral. There were private collectors, many of them repeat buyers who had trusted Philbrick for years, who submitted victim impact letters describing not just the financial loss, but the ordinary humiliation of having believed him. And there was the mentor, the man who had staked him, who had made his gallery possible, who had corresponded for a year with Martin Herrero, believing him to be a real person. His victim impact statement was among the most cited in the courtroom. He described the discovery. He described what it felt like to realize that not only was the money gone, but that the very correspondence he had trusted, the very reassurances that had kept him patient, had been authored by the person who owed him. On May 23, 2022, in a wood-paneled courtroom of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan, Judge Sidney H. Stein imposed sentence. He addressed the courtroom for several minutes before pronouncing the term. He acknowledged the letters he had received from Philbrick's supporters. He acknowledged the defendant's youth, his family, his infant daughter. He acknowledged the plea. Then he described what Philbrick had done. He described a scheme that had endured for years. He described the invention of a fictional collector, sustained over months of active correspondence, aimed at deceiving the very person who had believed in him. He described the manufactured documents, the falsified provenances, the ownership stakes tallied above 100%. He described the audacity of pledging as collateral property already sold to somebody else. He said, and this quote was widely reported in the trade press afterward, that the defendant's crimes were particularly egregious because they had been carried out against people who trusted him in a market that operates on trust. 84 months, 7 years, 2 years supervised release, forfeiture of $86,672,790, restitution to be determined through separate proceedings involving multiple civil parties. Philbrick was designated to serve his term at a low-security federal facility. He served roughly 2/3 of the sentence before being released in early 2024. The forfeiture obligation remains outstanding. The civil suits on 3 continents are ongoing. The paintings that were at the heart of the scheme, the Basquiat, the Wool, the Stingel, have been sold at auction and through negotiated resolution, with proceeds distributed to some of the injured parties. Some of the collectors were made whole, more or less. Others were not. The FBI's art crime team continues to describe the case as the largest art fraud in United States history, and the contemporary art market, the one that runs on trust and reputation and confidential paperwork, the one whose entire premise Philbrick tested to failure, has changed remarkably little in response. There is still no central registry of ownership. There is still no regulator. There are still confidential joint ventures, still private valuations, still paintings sitting in Freeport warehouses whose paperwork nobody in the world has independently verified. Someone else, somewhere, is almost certainly running a smaller version of the same play right now. This case was elaborate, but the case on your screen right now might be the most brazen white-collar operation we have ever covered on this channel.